As the 2022 Australian hop harvest draws to a close, beer drinkers will be getting to experience the release of the 2022 wet hop ales. Interestingly, brewing with green hops is still a relatively recent development, or at least recently rediscovered aspect in brewing, but one that has great potential to educate beer drinkers about provenance and also the agricultural nature of beer. But there's a lot for brewers to be aware of to execute a great green hop beer. And that's what this BreweryPro panel is going to look at, planning and executing a great green hop beer. To join us in this discussion, I'm joined by Owen Johnston, Sales and Marketing Manager for Hop Products Australia and former Head Brewer at Moo Brew, as well as the Hop Trial Beer Company. Welcome, OJ.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Haven't heard the Hop Trial Beer Company's name for a while. Are we still doing that?
Mate, it's been parked for the time being. HPA got busy and a couple of kids landed on the deck in between times, and that's really stuffed my hobbies.
Well, we can come back to that, and we're certainly going to be talking about hop trials today. Also joined by Richard Watkins, a three-time crowned Australian champion brewer and claims the title of Australia's longest-serving craft brewer. He spent much of his career as head brewer at Canberra's renowned Wigan Pen before embarking on the venture that is Bespoke Brewing Company with partner Tracy Margrain. He is highly regarded as a brewer known for pushing boundaries of his craft. And this year, when Bespoke picked up its second Hottest 100 crown, Richard was described by one of our panelists as one of Australia's best recipe developers. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having us on.
We'll have to. I don't think we'll get into the debate about what qualifies you for Australia's longest craft brewer for this chat, but I think there's a discussion in that one.
Sounds good.
And we're also joined by Reid Stratton, head brewer at Bright Brewing Company, smack bang in the middle of hop country. Formerly of New England Brewing Company in New South Wales, he has also brewed at Jolly Pumpkin Artisanales in Michigan and Grand Teton Brewing in Idaho. Welcome for the first time to a BreweryPro podcast, Reid Stratton.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Now, OJ, we might start with you with a little bit of background to green hops. And how do brewers get access to green hops if they are hearing about them on this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. Thanks very much. Look, we open expressions of interest and publicise what it is that we're going to offer in our in our seasonal release or access to wet hops and green hops coming off the farm every year. We start to talk about that in November. We typically leave orders open November, December through to the end of January, leading into the crop year. Now I know this is asking brewers to get organised, so it's a long way off, but we do need to shut the door on taking orders so that we can get the operational aspects of harvest bedded down, and whether it's ordering packaging or labour, getting the labour force organised to bring in the orders. This year we had something like 35 breweries, mostly in the vicinities of the hop farms and picking up from farm. We mailed out, shipping through the eastern seaboard to only a few actually this year. So really it's a really regional program, which is excellent, because that's the spirit of the endeavour here is not to ship green hops into Hong Kong or something silly like that. That is not the spirit of the deal. In a sort of similar way to drinking in the shadow of the brewery, this is about the link between local agriculture and local beer. So if people are interested, if they're listening to this because they're interested in green hop beers, we'll open the program again for the 2023 harvest in November, but feel free to shoot your HPA rep or myself an email and we'll come back to you when the program opens.
But that is one of the exciting things about beers made with freshly harvested hops is it does really highlight that agricultural nature of beer as a product. For us, it's really important. It's not just about outreach to our brewing customers, and we've been working with Rich and Reid for a long time on these beers. So it's not necessarily about us reaching out to brewers. It's a little more about re-establishing that agricultural link between beer in general and the consumer. So if brewers, it's hard for us as a hop farmer to talk to beer drinkers, and this is one of the ways in which we can sort of be part of that conversation and bring the focus back onto what makes great beer, and the most romantic ingredient in beer is, of course, hops.
and it's at our special time of the year through harvest. So it's our way of trying to invigorate that link between beer, the beer drinker, and Aussie agriculture.
And one of the things that interests me the most is, if you trace the modern craft beer movement back to, 1980 with Sierra Nevada being one of the really touch points for that. Fresh hop beers, beers made with the green hops is a relatively new endeavor, and there's a little bit of discussion about where it came from. But Cascade's first harvest was a very early beer to do that, wasn't it? It doesn't really go back much before around about 2000.
Yeah, I think Cascade first harvest might have been 2002.
2002, there was a pilot batch the year before. I think they were, and I'll link to a great article that a couple of the people who were involved in the very early ones, where CUB was going to emulate the Beaujolais Nouveau of the French vintage, race hops, on the ferry up to Sydney to brew up there. But then Cascade took it over very early, is the history that I've been able to get. But it didn't really globally, even it didn't really predate that very much, did it?
Well, and you've kind of linked those two pieces together there, because you've talked about Sierra Nevada and the craft movement in the 80s and all that sort of stuff, but there's inherent logistical barriers to this stuff. And like I said before, I don't think that what we're seeking to achieve is green hop internationally or freeze drying it and shipping it into the UK or anything like that. I just don't think that is actually the spirit of the deal we're talking about here. Those days of rushing hops off the farm still exist today, and I can vouch for these two gentlemen brewers who are with us that we do, everything we can to get those hops off the paddock and overnight out of Tassie, or of course Reed just drives down the road and picks them up same day, and it's really important, that timeliness and that issue of rushing them down to the brewery and making a great beer with them is still relevant today, with a practical eye to the challenges we face in freight.
Just from a technical perspective, what are the challenges? Just explain to brewers who maybe aren't aware of what happens to hops from the moment they're picked that makes the logistical challenges in keeping these beers fresh, or keeping these hops fresh.
It's a bit of a conundrum, really, because they're still sitting, at say 75% moisture at this point, and if you hang around too much, it's much like a lettuce left in the crisper in your fridge for a week. It's going to go a bit mushy, and these things are still respiring, so to speak. They are degrading. They will give off moisture, and that condensation will sit on the outside of them, and they get pretty messy in a short order of time. And that sort of degradation, it's tolerable in a pinch, but I don't think in the pursuit of what these beers are about that it's a great thing. We certainly recommend using them in a timely manner, and if you have to store them, probably freeze them. But they're so bulky, that's also a bit of a challenge.
Rich, when was the first time that you brewed with fresh hops?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I remember when I first started, 96, and so that's sort of validating that claim of one of Australia's longest serving craft brewers. I'm not sure who's been brewing consistently since before 96, but I'll throw that out there. I was part of the Canberra Brewers Amateur Brew Club then, and so many of the Canberra brewers were growing hops, and we brewed a beer at the Wig and Pen using a series of different hops from about 20 different backyards. And that was around the 2000 mark, because I remember we did the Bicentennial Ale, and that was using fresh hops. And we had to figure out a way to use them. That was the hardest part that I had to figure out, was how do I use these fresh hops without clogging up my heat exchanger, for instance? And I remember we worked out this way to use our mash tun as a hop back, and we managed to put them into the mash tun, and we recirculated the wort from the kettle through the mash tun back into the heat exchanger. And the mash tun, or the lauter tun, mash lauter tun it was, and had a nice screen in the bottom, so that separated the hot wort from the hops. And that was my first time that I did it, and just the amazing aromas and flavors that you get from using green hops is something you only get to experience once every year. So I think from then, every year I've brewed a wet hop beer. I don't think I've missed brewing a wet hop beer in 25 years, 26 years.
It's interesting to hear you describe that challenge, because I think Max Burslam had to do the same thing with the Cascade Brewery. OJ had to try and use the mash tun as a hop back in some form as well.
Yeah, Rich, honestly, I thought you were going to open up with after the floods in 1974. But Matt, certainly correct me if I'm wrong. I reckon it was Mick Jontiff that was throwing Maxi Burslam under the bus there, trying to make that first harvest beer. And Max is dealing with the 1927 brewhouse there at Cascade, and it is not amenable to just a bit of soft pipe between this outlet and that outlet, and we'll just pump that back over there. That sort of flexibility is a bit of a nightmare. So they're still on that brewhouse, and they still, in very much the similar vein to what Rich has described, they still go back on top of their lauter tun, fill the lauter tun up, and recirc there. Reed, I think that's still a process you use.
Yeah, that certainly must be the most common technique. It's just, as you said, because of the bulk of the hops, it's hard to imagine any other really suitable solution. You could fill 100 muslin bags, or maybe more, possibly 1,000 muslin bags, but then you have to fish those all out by hand as well. So I think that's definitely the lauter tun as hop back has got to be the number one preferred technique for most brewers.
When was the first time you got to use green hops, Reed?
The first time was when I was brewing in the States, some 10-something years ago. I was brewing in Idaho, which is not famous as a hop growing region, but actually there are quite a lot of hop farms in the western part of that state, which start to get closer to the Yakima Valley and areas that are more famous for hop growing in the U.S. And for a long time, up until around the time when I started brewing, there were all these hop farms that were just strictly contracted for Anheuser-Busch to be turned into CO2 extract for bittering only, like just absolute commodity farms. And they had just started planting like aromatic varieties for the first time. So we got like fresh hops off of their new plantings of aromatic vines. I want to say it was Centennial that we used our first year there. Drove across the state. It was about 4 or 5 hours away from where the brewery was. So loaded up a truck, drove them all back over pretty much first thing in the morning. And we had a brewer there standing by with like the wort like in the kettle ready to go, and dumped them all in. It was kind of a bit of an adventure doing that for the first time.
I honestly, just to jump in there, Matt, I honestly think that's one of the best benefits from the brewer's point of view. It's about engagement and the brewers getting to do something different, and it's a bit exciting, and maybe you don't even know quite what the outcome's going to be, and that's a bit of a skills test. And as far as for the guys and girls operating the brew houses on a rinse and repeat basis every day, I think the green hop adventure is still pretty cool.
But I think for the consumer as well, because one of the things that I was reading about in the States, if you've got a seasonal beer or a holiday beer, such as a pumpkin ale, they talk about the creep, like we get hot cross buns on January 1st in Australia. With, green hop beers, you can't bring that date forward because you can only have them when the green hops are available.
We've tried. we don't. Richard, how do you get those 2 or 3 crops a year up in the ACT? How do we do that? No, you're absolutely right, Matt. There's no Christmas decorations in October. There's nothing like that. Right?
So, Rich, you did talk a little bit about the sensory difference with green hops versus, and I need to be careful because all hops that are coming from suppliers like HPA are fresh, but these are the green hops. So the wet green hops. Rich, you talked about the sensory differences. What are some of the differences with, a beer made with dried hops or pelletized hops and the green hops that have just been harvested?
Yeah, look, I find you still get it. There is still a lot of similarity you can get from using the same variety in different stages in brewing. So you're still going to get some of the same flavors from using a hop in a kettle or dry hopping, or as you will using green hops. But what you do get from green hops that you don't get from any other type of hop is that chlorophyll sort of green, raw green character. It's sort of a little bit undescribable in a way too, because it does really accentuate a lot of other characters in the hops. So for me, getting that burst of whether it's citrus or tropical characters or herbal characters that you would normally get, and then chuck in a bit of that green sort of raw chlorophyll sort of character, I reckon is just gives it such good balance. And all I was going to say was it does depend on how I find contact time with the green hops is really important. So whilst we were using our lauter as a way to separate or keep the hops separated from the wort and be able to process the beer, we've actually built a purpose-built green hop vessel, which is basically we come out of the kettle. It's like a hop back. Basically, it's a hop back. And it's got a stainless screen around the side, and it's designed to only hold a certain amount of volume. So we might literally fill it to the brim with wet hops, but there'll only ever be about 100 litres or 140 litres of actual hot wort in there at any one time. We're pumping it straight off the hops, and the wort's coming in as we pump out. And I find that does make sure that you don't get the stewed hop character, so to speak, because the same wort's not sitting in contact with those green hops for too long. You're freshening up the wort. And we also do stop halfway through our pump out and actually recharge the hop back with more green hops as well, so we don't get a lot of that stew. We don't want to get I call it the what's the technical term, AJ? What's the spine in the middle of the cone?
The strig.
I don't want to get that flavour into the beer. So you don't want to have it sit around for that long that you get the strig character.
How about you, Reid? What do you get as the sensory elements of using green hops?
Yeah, I think Richard it definitely covered it in the sense that obviously if you're using a common variety like we use Galaxy in our green hop beer this year, and that's a hop that we're really familiar with. So particularly when we get the raw hops in and we're smelling the green hops, totally different from the pelletized Galaxy hops we use year round. Like you couldn't mistake them. But by the time they kind of go through the processing stage of steeping through the hot wort and fermentation and everything else, the character I do think becomes a lot more similar to the pelletized hops that we're used to, with the addition of that grassy doesn't quite cover it. I think that green flavor that Richard was talking about is something a little more nuanced than just to say it's like grassy. It's not really astringent either. It's this kind of funny combination of characteristics, and like with Richard, we've also every year I think been reducing our contact time little bit by little bit as we start to kind of. The more we brew these beers, you only get the one chance a year, so you have to kind of recall what did we do last year? How did we like the results? Think about changing it this year. And we also find that kind of like boiled flavor, that boiled vegetable flavor kind of, there's absolutely a threshold for that. If you try to extract maximum flavor from those green hops, not all the flavor is going to be really nice flavors. So we try to find that sweet spot of getting the nice fresh flavors, but not the cooked kind of green vegetable flavors.
Well, that being the case, are there some styles that lend themselves better to using the green hops than others to make sure that you're not getting those flavors?
We've only ever really tried them in IPA hoppy beer styles because the beer style itself obviously lends itself to sort of celebrating hops, which is what the final product is really about. I have seen that other breweries try them in a few other styles that presumably at lower rates, and I have to imagine that if we had if we had the ability to brew green hop beer once a week every year, and we could really dial it in, I think we probably would find a bit of a bell curve as to where the really best dosage rates and steeping times kind of come together. But since this is kind of like that, that bit of like harvest fun, let's just chuck a bunch in, get those really nice fresh flavors once a year, and kind of celebrate the season. I think absolutely the biggest challenge is the repeatability of these beers is really low. So we're always trying to, I guess, improve from on year to year and find the right application, for the hops.
How about you, Rich? Are there any styles that you find particularly work with the green hop beers?
Yeah, I think Reed's right. I mean, you're trying to celebrate, one of the obviously key ingredients in making beer, and obviously IPA does lend itself to really expressing the hops as best they can. This year we had a bit of a play around. Well, last year we actually had our first play around with a darker. We did a porter last year with a wet hop porter, and it went really well. That was using the Enigma. This year we actually got wet hops from 3 different hop farms. Majority we got from HPA, but we also got some wet hops from Ryefield hops, which aren't far away from us down the coast in south coast of New South Wales. So we got some Chinook and some some Victoria, and some Cascade. We also got some hops from another little hop farm closer to Canberra called Talaganda hops, which actually got flooded out big time this year. So they actually only had 19 kilos of hops off their farm, of which we managed to nab them all. So what we did this year, because we had the same variety off 3 farms, it was really interesting to compare the same variety coming from 3 different farms. And the Cascade that came out of HPA was really, like true to Cascade, quite, piney and a nice grapefruit sort of character, whereas the Cascade that came from Ryefield was more, probably slightly more tropical even. So we did an amber ale. We brewed an amber ale with the more tropical one to see how that would go, and that turned out pretty well. We did it's like a red amber ale, using Chinook and Cascade, and then the Talaganda hops we did the porter with, because they had a more of an earthy character to the hops. Certainly the Victoria did anyway. And then we made 2 IPAs using the HPA hops in different combinations. So we did one using just Cascade and Ella, and one using Ella and Enigma. And I think those combinations turned out really well. I'm probably maybe not ever, but most happy with the wet hop beers we've done this year than previous years. I think we were more prepared. To be fair, HPA got us the hops as quicker than before, so we were planned, ready to go. We literally were sitting there waiting we were tracking the truck and waiting for it to turn up. Like, it sat at the depot too long. We were hassling the depot to get it out to us, and so we could use it. We were sort of in that frame this year. And I think that's a big part of using these wet hops. You got to be prepared. You got to be ready to go. You don't want to get them into the brewery and then wait 2 days to use them. You literally want to get them in, and maybe you don't mash in at 7 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning. Maybe you mash in at 3 in the arvo when they've been delivered at 1 o'clock or something, so you can actually use them as quickly as you possibly can, because that 12 hours overnight, that can make a massive difference, I reckon. One year, I think we didn't use all of our hops straight away, and some of them sat in the cool room, and I actually thought at one point they were going to catch fire, because they were composting away, and the amount of heat that was coming off them in the cool room was playing up. I'm going, what's going on with the cool room? And it was because the hops were giving off so much heat. They were composting away. So we learned that lesson. We do make sure the hops are stored in like muslin bags in the cool room, so that they can actually naturally dry out a little bit. The cool room's actually pretty good for drying out hops, but it sucks all the moisture out of them. So it's actually a good thing to do, because we have a little hopinator infuser on the bar. So one of our wet hop beers is constantly flowing through that, and we're updating those hops in that hopinator twice a week. So the customers really get, not only do they get the beer, the wet hop beer straight off the tap, they also get it freshly infused with wet hops at the bar as well. And I think that infusion also adds some different flavors and characters as well. Probably more grassy notes, but I think the grassy notes blended with that green sort of raw character you get, plus the normal oil characters you get, really add massive complexity to the the hop character of the beer.
OJ, you wanted to jump in there?
Just wanted to ask Rich a question, really. Do you think, like, we know that all hops are not equal, right? So do you have any feedback for us on, in broad terms, throw modern US varieties in a bucket, so to speak, but do you know how the green hops perform between locally grown European or locally grown Aussie high alpha modern hops versus, say, some of the open market US grown here, like Centennial or Cascade or anything like that? Have you got a feel for, like, some generic rule of thumbs that these ones work better and these ones don't work as well?
Yeah, good question. Probably need to do some side-by-side stuff. I think that'd be the way to sort of really get an idea for that. I think the growing seasons, unfortunately, are very inconsistent each year, especially for the smaller producers. So for them, trying to get consistency in their hops is a real challenge, because one year they can struggle to get enough water, and next year, like this year, they've got so much water they're trying to get rid of it. The vines are all swimming in it, and they need to actually get rid of it, which is exactly what this Palaganda guy was doing. He was literally pumping water away from the hops.
Yeah, it's crazy. So it's hard to get.
You never hear of that in a hop farm. I think. I think my general rule of thumb is it's starting to evolve that the high alpha hops are actually better as grain hops. I'm not sure whether the higher alpha acids they obviously have a bigger part to play in it. I'm not sure of the full chemical processes there or reactions, but it does seem to me trending right now that high alpha hops do work better as grain hops.
I think there is something in there, and it's not that that high alpha and high oils are actually correlated, as in, like, not all high alpha have to have high oils, but certainly in the HPA suite of proprietaries out there at the moment, the higher alpha have higher oils as well. And this is a full circle back to some of the comments you guys have made about how to actually handle steep times versus some of the off flavors you might pick up. One of the traps about high oil and high alpha, from my point of view, is that you have to be really mindful of minimising your steep time, and whether that's pump into your lauter and pump out again, or as you're doing, Rich, as you described, pumping through a bed of hops. You risk picking up, even just if you look at high alpha alone, you risk picking up a lot of unisomerized alpha, and that will have a not as nice bitterness character as isomerized alpha. So, immediately you've got one of these pitfalls of your process and of the hops can have high impact, but you need to handle them appropriately to avoid some of the negative outcomes of what we're actually trying to capture.
And I think that's great. That's something definitely that we manage, because we don't actually add any hops to the kettle.
I don't think you need to.
In the wet hop beers we brew, we don't add any hops at all. We don't add even the smallest amount of bittering hop or anything at all to the kettle. It's the whole bitterness and balance of the beer comes from running through the wet hops in hot through and that's that unisomerized acid is what's providing that bitterness. But because it's the only thing providing bitterness, it doesn't come across as being super harsh or overly bitter or anything. These beers aren't overly bitter. I'd be very surprised if any of them above 40 IBU.
Absolutely. And to riff off something that Reed said about brewing IPAs with these, if you were brewing a style that didn't have a huge charge of wet hop, you might layer in some base backbone of bitterness in the kettle. You might put, I don't know, something to make it some semblance of balance, like 12 BUs or something like that, depending on what style you're making, and then allow the alpha that you pick up through the wet hop process to carry the rest of the load. If you're doing a huge charge, like filling your lauder up with hundreds of kilos of Galaxy, you're going to pick up enough bitterness there to carry an IPA. So, it's just it's sort of just like a proceed with caution. Another one of these recipe design issues where you need enough backbone in the beer to carry the residual sweetness, and you've got a sort of a sense of feel for what your process with wet hops will result in bitterness pickup, even if it's at a discount from normal isomerized bitterness, because unisomerized alpha is, something like, off the top of my head, it's something like 80% the bitterness of isomerized alpha. So you can sort of start to ballpark where you might end up without much precision, but you can at least have a feel for it.
One other thing I might just note there too is that we've tried a number of ways to I don't even know what the terminology is. Dry hop using green hops. There must be a better phrase than that. But anyway, that's what I'm going to call it.
Wet dry hop.
They call that a mess.
Yeah, and to me, it just doesn't work. You don't get anything good out of it at all. It's the beer itself doesn't break down any of the characters or oils or any out of the hops. You just get a heap of vegetal characters, which you start to question whether you've actually got a DMS problem in your boil or whatever. So we definitely won't do any more dry hopping using green hops unless someone comes up with a new hop that works really well or a new technique. But conventional dry hopping, I'll never do with green hops. But with the IPA, we still did a dry hop addition because I felt that it does accentuate those wet hop characters and not saying you have to do a dry hop as well as using the wet hops in an IPA. You certainly don't. You can still make an IPA with straight wet hops, but we felt in our beer we needed to back it up with some. I think the IPA was Cascadanella. That was the one that we dry hop with those two varieties as well. So it was consistent in varieties. We didn't change varieties. It was just we felt it needed a little bit more to balance it. And it worked really well. The beer's better for being dry hop than it is for not.
Reed, did you dry hop your wet hop beer this year?
Yeah, we typically do add dry hops. It sounds very similar to Richard, our recipe, which is in the no kettle hops, just green hops only on the hot side, and then dry hops. So this year, for the past 2 years now, we've done like a hazy style. Which obviously to get the characteristics, you really need dry hops in there or you're not going to have much haze and that mouthfeel. So we sort of really consider like the green hops to be like the base flavor of that. And then we just start to kind of add and layer other flavors on top of that for our green hop beer.
I think one of the pitfalls, Rich, in your description there is that steep time issue applies to the wet hopping, the dry hopping of wet hops. Equally. So, a few days, even cold, is fraught with danger. And then, of course, there's that solubility issue. Without the turbulence of either pump in, pump out, or even rakes spinning in the lauder or pumping through a bed of hops, you don't get... Hop cones are quite a densely packed, pine coney looking thing, which we're all familiar with. And they actually don't allow... They're designed to keep the rain out from the strig. They're actually not. They're not designed to let wort pump through and solubilize the lupulin glands and rupture them and pick up the oils that you're looking for. So there's inherently some physical problems with trying to get beneficial flavour pickup from a wet hop beer with whole cone.
Yeah, well, the cone just fully collapses too. Once it's actually soaked, you're not going to get anything into the cone. Like we're constantly stirring our wet hops, and we manage, as we manage the flow of wort in and the flow of wort out, so it keeps the same level. But we're constantly manually stirring it to mix in, and so we want to break up as many of those hop flowers as possible so that we can let the wort get to the lupulin. I feel like sometimes we didn't do it this year, but last year we pulled out heaps of hop flowers last year, and the kitchen actually used them. They caramelized them with sugar and stuff, and we used them on our ploughman's board and as an additive. And that was simply because there's still so much flavour in them. I couldn't believe how much flavour was still in the hops. So this year we made a bit more of an effort to get more of the flavour out. And I think manually stirring them constantly during pump out certainly helped. I mean, we're only a small brew pub, so we can't put an automatic mixer in, but you certainly need to agitate your wet hops. I think that's a big thing for getting the best flavour out.
OJ, how does HBA choose which hops you use in the green hop program year to year? Is there a hop variety that works better that you found?
Well, no, we're much more mercenary than that. We just want to talk about our own stuff, and we actually, from the practical considerations of it, we bring the execution of the green hop pick forward in the harvest, and there's a couple of practical reasons for that: to stay out from under the feet of the main commercial pick. We've got farm managers and foremen who have a very important job to do, and we don't want them necessarily distracted by individual orders. So we bring it all forward. We accept that, for instance, a hop like Vic's Secret or Galaxy that might harvest later in the month of March might be outside, for instance, a bit early outside its ideal pick. But as we've sort of been talking about, we're actually seeing flavours driven by myrcene, for instance, and giving us this grassy, woody complexity, and that is already there. And so a lot of the oil profile is already there. Because they're, if you like raw hops without kiln drying or pelleting, the total oil per 100 gram of dried material on a dry basis is very, very high, right? So they might not have the ultimate profile of the commercial pick, but in terms of impact and driving flavour, there are things on our side that let us bring our green hop pick forward. So we choose to execute the most of it from Bushy Park, where we have sort of an easier, more resourced customer service and order fulfilment machine down here. And of course, Bushy grows Cascade and Enigma and Ella and Galaxy. And then from the Ross Trevor farm, Vic Secret and Eclipse. So we basically make everything we grow available, with some caveats that if you want Cascade, which is only grown at Bushy Park, and you want Eclipse, which is only grown at Ross Trevor, they're probably not going to turn up on the same day. So there's another practical challenge for the brewer to have to adapt and work with. It's not very convenient. It's not easy. It's not convenient. Thankfully,
it's only one.
Green hop beers aren't about convenience, though, AJ.
They're definitely not.
We got the wet hops from Myrtleford last year. This year, obviously, got them from Bushy Park, and I don't really think any difference in quality, even though they obviously had to get shipped further. I mean, we're not quite in the lucky position of Reed who can drive down the road and pick them up. Next year we'll probably have to make that effort and I think do that. So we'll talk about that. And I think actually I'm at the point now where I've got enough info where I actually want to just release a seasonal can with wet hop beer in a can. I know it's not something new. Heaps of people do. Heaps of brewers have done it and do it. But being able to do it and know that the beer will still taste good in a couple of months in the can has been a challenge, I think. And having those, because they're not, the hop flavors aren't as stable. But I think now that we're really the contact time of the wet hops and the wort is critical. I think that certainly gives you much better stable hop characters that last. So I'm pretty keen to give it a go next year.
That was one of the things I wanted to specifically ask. Are there any differences between keg and packaged beer, or different considerations you have to have when you package the beer? Are we going to see, green hop beers, nationally in one of the big retailers, for example, or are they something that really should be kept to a local market?
We have released our green hop beer in package for a while now, and certainly we see. I mean, I sort of consider every hoppy beer a real challenge to package and make sure it's turning over well. And for green hop beers in particular, I think there's kind of two challenges. One kind of inside the can and one outside the can. Outside the can, I mean that because it is hyper seasonal, harvest season sort of beer, it really crushes me when I see a can of harvest beer in November. Sitting on the shelf somewhere. It's just not a good look. Even if the beer tasted amazing inside somehow, it's just not really kind of the point of that particular endeavor, to have a really long offering for it. And then inside the can, as Richard said, I do think that there is something about those green hops that do have a little less stability. As I said, for our typical styles, we're usually adding dry hops and a few other things, so it sort of maybe averages out to closer to a typical hoppy beer for us. But we definitely do see the drop off after the first couple of months pretty precipitously. So we try to get ahead of that by just keeping our very realistic numbers around our packaging quantities and expectations around how much of this we should make in order to sell it really quite quickly and keep it kind of just to the season.
Yeah, wise words, Reid. Wise words.
So, but Rich, you haven't packaged yet. So, did you have any special considerations you were looking at in packaging your green hop beer?
Oh, much the same. We want to see it. For me, the hop season's a good opportunity to get consumer involvement and actually getting them learning about one of the probably equally most important ingredient in beer, because the consumer can see malt all the time. Obviously they can see water, they see yeast bubbling away, but they don't get to see fresh hops very often, and we hang them up like every year since 2000. I've hung up hop vines at the brewery where I am. So whether it's been Wig and Pen or Benspoke, we hang up hop vines in our pub every single year, and you know what? They last through the year. They still look like hop vines when we pull them down 2 weeks before we get the new ones. They're dried and they've copped a heap of different weather changes and whatever, but they still hang up, and people still pick a cone off when it's dry and rub it in their hands and smell it, and you still get something out of it, even if it's been hanging up for a year. And I think that's awesome that customers can actually see and touch what real hops are. And that's probably the next step for us, is to get a beer in a can that we can have it all sold in 2 weeks, and retailers only get 2 cartons each or whatever it is, to try and make sure that it's all gone in 4 weeks, and we don't have the problem like what Reid's saying of having a carton of beer sitting around in October advertising a March hop harvest.
I'd just be worried about.
It hasn't been easy doing some of those things. For me, I just don't rush in and chuck a beer in a can, because we'll be talking about probably 2,000 cartons of beer. So we want to make sure that we can, obviously get the beer right, get the recipe right. It's not like you can practice all year round with this. You get very limited opportunities to practice using wet hop. So it's for me, it's like one of the things I look forward to most in the brewing calendar each year. And we haven't been able to can small batches for a while. So, I mean, I always make sure I taste Reid's beers in the can and Beechworth's beers. Don't worry, Reid, they're always tasting pretty good. But I learned from doing that so that I can hopefully get our hop harvest beer going at some point.
Yeah, just to jump on what Richard's saying, definitely the harvest season is an awesome time for our bartenders and stuff to talk to our patrons, because because the way we're positioned near the hop farms, most people coming to Bright have to drive past the hop farms, so they see those big, strange, tall green columns of foliage as they come in and out of Bright. A lot of them don't know what it is. A lot of people don't know what hops are, right? Because you don't see them at the supermarket. And so it's so when we have our harvest beer on tap, it's such a really powerful way to actually say all of our beers have hops in them, but this beer in particular is really special because the hops came from just over there right in that farm that you were just driving past, and they were picked just a few hours before they were used, and it's got a really awesome local connection for us. So we really appreciate that.
I think that's as good a place as any to drop it. Does anyone have any last observations, OJ?
Yeah, just one more from me. Rich, to your point about making the effort to drive on down and pick up your green hops, we look forward to welcoming all of our brewers and brewing customers back on the farms in the next year. It's been a couple of years since we've had the gates open to any non-essential people, involved in delivering the harvest. So for anyone listening that's keen on green hops and a farm tour, do what Rich is going to do, drive on down and come and say good day. And you'll know exactly where they come from and exactly how fresh they are and how good they smell.
Well, let's go one step further, OJ. Let's set up a small little brewery on the farm, just a little one, actually brew a beer on the farm. I reckon if we can get Reed involved in that, we could start.
I was going to say,
we could actually do the tour and actually use the hops off the vine straight into the hop back.
I like the idea a lot, but I know this brewery just down the road, literally about 15 minutes, and they've got a great setup and they make great beers. So we should just use their kit rather than setting up anything else.
I'm sure we could just wheel it easily, just tow it down the road on a trailer.
Why don't we send one of the tractors with a trailer on it down to his place?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Richard Watkins, Reed Stratton, and Owen Johnston, thank you very much for joining us for this BreweryPro podcast, talking about the green hops and making beers seasonally with them. All the very best. I look forward to trying the beers. In Brisbane, I may not get them fresh, so I might have to make a special effort to come down to both your breweries to try them fresh. But thank you for joining us for this podcast today.
Cheers. Thanks, man.